Welcome. What we will learn today includes the concept of real estate, as well as titles and their attributes, types of tenancy and types of properties, and definition by measurement using the township as the standard, possession of property, deeds and their conveyance from giver to receiver, restrictions of use imposed privately and publicly, and finally mortgages, how they're transferred and how they affect the larger financial markets. First, we'll start with the concept of real estate. How can we define it? The elemental concept of real estate, the American tradition of property rights, is largely derived from the Anglo-Saxon tradition. Actually, the concept of real estate begins with some Nordic cosmology, early informal English tradition, Saxon common law, and then finally the first written document, the Magna Carta. We can visualize property starting along a shoreline, looking at a point on the horizon, and to the right we see the sea, to the left the earth, above the air, and then focusing downward beneath the surface, the core. Secondly, if we face inland and draw a horizon line, then above the horizon is the sky, and that helps us to determine air rights and the height of buildings, etc. And then the ground in terms of the use of the surface of the earth, whereas the core defines mineral rights. As we face away from land out to sea, again we'll draw a horizon line, the sky above and the sea below, and generally speaking we can on a clear day see about 12 to 15 miles out to sea because of the curvature of the earth, and this helps us to define the difference between a sovereign state and international waters. Next, we'll talk about titles and the attributes of these documents. We'll start with the title, which is known as a fee simple. This is the most common one, and generally ownership of residential property is fee simple. It reflects a bundle of rights. The right to dispose of the property, to sell or give it away, the use of the property, of course the possession of that property, which is what the title's about, and the ability to and the right to exclude others from using the property. The difference between real estate and real property has to do with the title. Real estate plus the title equals what we call real property. And freehold tenancy, there is an indefinite duration of time. Freehold estate tenancy it's called. It can go on somewhat perpetually and be passed along from one party, one generation to another. The freehold may be fee simple, could be a life estate where someone has the right to live in a house until they pass away, and then is prearranged to be turned over to another party. And generally this party is called a remainder man, is the traditional term. Title is equal to the estate minus the tenancy. So what we have then is the bundle of rights, the right of disposition, of use, possession, and exclusion, which we abbreviate as DUPE. A non-freehold has a limited duration of time to it, of how long a person may hold this. So it's a non-freehold, generally referred to as a leasehold, that involves having a lease contract, which specifies a duration of time. This lease is similar to the title, except there's one of these property rights, a bundle of rights, which is not there, and that is the right to dispose of the property, to sell it or to give it away. Though there is with the lease the right to use it, to possess it, and to exclude others from using it. Here we have a comparison chart, and you may want to pause the video because of the amount of content here, but the key features here is a freehold has an indefinite duration, the non-freehold has a limited duration, and the bundle of rights in the freehold include all four: disposition, use, possession, and exclusion, whereas the lease or leasehold excludes the right of disposition. So estate is equal to the title, is equal to this bundle of four rights to the property. Let's talk about the types of tenancy and also types of properties. Again, you may want to pause, take a look at this chart, but there's tenancy in severalty, a number of people, in common, oftentimes between a married couple, and where there's heirs specified for that tenancy. In a joint estate, there is something called right of survivors, so anyone surviving has the right to continue the tenancy, and they have that fee simple, they have that fourfold rights of property. By entireties, right of survivor, and the same rights. In terms of properties, there is business property, service sector, industrial property, generally manufacturing, commercial, both wholesale and retail, residential property, and agricultural property. Residential properties can be defined as 4 or less units or vacant land that is zoned for residential use, or it could also be 10 or less acres of agricultural land. That's small. It lacks the natural condition for being a good working farm. If we move on to definition by measurement, we're going to look at the township as our basic standard of measurement. A township is 6 miles by 6 miles square, in other words 36 square miles, encompassing 23,040 acres. To measure this, let's take an example of an uncharted island in one of your regular form, and on this we're going to draw a baseline and meridian. Try to center it as close to the center as possible, whatever is practical. For simplicity's sake, in our measurement here, we're going to use the full township. You can also carry over onto the water around this island. So we measure the island, and we're going to have measurements down to quarter miles. So if we measure the entire island, we've created the entire area, we want to determine how many square miles are in the yellow island that is bordered by the red boundary line. We're not really concerned with the water at this time. We can use square quarter miles to do the estimation, and we find that this island is 368.75 square miles. It's 23.5 miles long and 23.5 miles wide. Let's go back to our standard unit of measurement, which is the township, which is 6 miles by 6 miles, 36 square miles, or 23,040 acres. And we're going to look at how we can further subdivide this. If we subdivide a township, we're going to have 36 square mile sections. So each section is 1 square mile and includes 640 acres. If we subdivide this into quarter sections, so each section is a quarter of a square mile, there are 160 acres. And the boundaries of this are 1/2 mile by 1/2 mile. If we subdivide further, where we have land which is 1/4 mile by 1/4 mile, this is a 1/16 of a section, which is a 1/16 of a square mile, and 40 acres, which is traditionally a size of a workable family farm. This 40 acres can be further divided as subdivision, residential property. In terms of possession of property, first we can talk about voluntary alienation, giving up the right to possess the land voluntarily with an instrument of conveyance, of transfer of these rights, through a deed or through a will. Involuntary alienation occurs when a person dies without a will, and in that case the property goes to the probate court and the court decides. Also, if they die without a will and without heirs, this is called a sheet, and in this case the property is deeded over to the state government. Involuntary alienation can include things like eminent domain and condemnation by eminent domain, in which a government, if they pay a fair value for the property, can take over that property regardless of whether the present owner wants to keep it or not. Usually this is for some larger public good, constructing an expressway or other things like this. Adverse possession may be hostile, or it could just simply be open possession without permission, and also may include taxation, because if taxes are not paid on the property, the municipality or the county can take that property over for lack of taxes being paid. Clear adverse possession may occur if there's a legitimate claim on the title or simply flagrant possession of moving in and occupying the land, though it could be if there's property which there's no apparent claim and a person resides on that property for 7 years, this is by common law, then they can claim ownership to what would be an abandoned property. Voluntary alienation requires an instrument of conveyance, a transfer, usually a deed, but oftentimes a conveyance of a title. On this chart here, and when it's complete you may want to pause the video and take a look at it, what we have is the instruments which may be transferred, the giver and the receiver. Now the giver, many different names here for them, but they all represent the point of origin, and so their names end with an OR. The receiver, that's the end recipient, so that name ends with a double E. Easy way to remember this. So if the instrument of a, say, title or deed is given by a grantor to a receiver known as the grantee. Deeds and their conveyance. A deed is an instrument of conveyance, of transfer, that occurs between two parties. One party represents the giver, the other party the receiver. The giver, who is the grantor, most likely the seller, gives the deed to the grantee who is the buyer. Now, for an example, it may be a sale by owner property, and in which case that for sale by owner gives the deed or title both to the borrower, who is the receiver. In different states, there is an application of a different theory of who has the predominant right over the property. This is lien theory versus title theory. Under lien theory, the grantee, mortgager, the buyer of the property, has a legal control, whereas in the title theory state, it's the mortgagee, the lender, who maintains that control. A deed is a recorded constructive notice. So a constructive notice, something that's going to be in writing, and it's filed as a public record. An actual notice is more traditional. A person would stand in the middle of the town, all the neighbors would come about, and he would say, "I now own this piece of property," and describe it to them. This is not written, it's not filed, it's an informal note. There's a number of different types of deeds. Here are some of them that we consider, that we see most often. A bargain and sale deed, or a quitclaim deed that clarifies what the property is. Also special warranty deeds and general warranty deeds. Free and clear, are free of all encumbrance deeds. These are what the name suggests. Deed requirements are that there must be a premise, in other words, a grantor and a grantee. There must be some interchange between them. Also, there is something known as the habedim clause or cession clause, which goes back to the Middle Ages, that is to have and to hold the property. There must be a consideration given, money or other valuables, or it could be something which is good, as simple as love and affection. And this goes back to many centuries when wives were considered chattel property as real estate. So you can. A valid deed is one that is signed by the grantor along with two witnesses. And it has to be offered voluntarily by the grantor and accepted voluntarily by the grantee. Encumbrance, or lack thereof. If there is no encumbrances, then the property, the deed, is free and clear. There's no liens on it. In other words, there's no financial obligation that when the property is sold, somebody can claim a portion of the sales price to pay off a lien. As we said, this deed is an instrument of conveyance between two parties. And as we have seen before, the two parties are the giver and the receiver. Now, if we look at the transaction that occurs between giver and receiver, an example here is the giver is a grantor and also the seller, and the receiver is the grantee and buyer of the property. So the giver is a note giver to the receiver, who is the mortgagor, the borrower. And by doing this, there's an entitlement of those basic rights, which are disposition, use, possession, and exclusion. There are conditions of a title that have to be considered. First is the chain of the title, sometimes going back to some original land grant. There has to be established an uninterrupted chain in the title being passed from one party to the next. This is done through a title search, and the title search is basically summarized in a document called an abstract of title, and an opinion as to the quality of the search, as to the cleanliness of the deed, and the passage of title is given. Also, title insurance has an important role in all this because it protects both parties. Owners, it protects them for the purchase price that they're paying, and it protects the lenders in terms of the loan amount, and protects both parties from cases of forgeries that may have happened in the present or in the distant past in respect to the deed, in respect to the title. The restrictions of use of a property can be either private or public. The private restrictions may be deed restrictions actually written into the deed, or some restrictive covenant that is added to that. There may be a restriction listed in a lease as to how many people may live in a property, whether there can be pets, or liens are an obligation that can't be collected immediately. And we'll talk about easement in a second, but what we're looking for is deeds which are essentially as free and clear as possible. Government restrictions involve something as simple as zoning, how the property is to be used. Also, the use of eminent domain to acquire property, and the ability to tax property. This puts a certain restriction because if a person doesn't pay the property taxes, they forfeit the property to the government. Encroachment and easement. This has to do with adjacent property and the rights of adjacent property owners. Encroachment is if one person uses somebody else's property or moves a fence onto that property without permission. An easement is the opposite, and a very simple example is a person opens a car door, gets out onto the lawn which belongs to the house of their neighbor. There's generally a 1-foot easement. Now we'll look at mortgages in a little bit more depth. A mortgage tells us that the mortgager is the grantee giving the mortgage, is the borrower, and is the buyer. So the two parties involved in these transactions, we have again the giver and the receiver. Now the giver would be the mortgager, who is the buyer, and is also the grantee. They're going to give a promissory note and mortgage to the mortgagee and lender, which is often a bank, but that party is the note holder that then gives loan money to the note giver, who is the buyer. If we look at a monthly payment for a piece of property, it's usually a fixed monthly payment, and part of it is principal and part of it is interest. At the beginning of a mortgage, most of that monthly payment is interest, very little of it is principal, paying down the balance on the property. But as time goes on, as we get to the years near the end of the mortgage, most of that payment becomes principal paid and very little of it is interest. Mortgage is made up of different payments. The principal and the interest together are referred to as debt service. But there's also, in most mortgages, taxes which are paid and insurance which is paid, and those are paid into an impounded fund called an escrow account, and they're included as part of a monthly payment. They're held in escrow and then dispersed. So we have debt service and we have escrow impounds, and these two items together make up the total amount which would be paid monthly, and call that PITI, pity, and this includes, again, principal, interest, taxes, and insurance. A promissory note, obligation to pay, is signed by the mortgager who is borrowing money and is promising to pay it back. The mortgage is recorded, becomes a security instrument, in respect to the property. It's a voluntary lien that the lender will get paid. It's signed by the mortgager, and in the event of non-payment, as a document, facilitates the act of foreclosure. When mortgages enter into the financial market in clusters, they often get bundled into other financial instruments. What we found in the first decade of the 21st century was that lenders were turning, to a very large degree, to issuing subprime mortgages, very high-risk mortgages with very little security. Potentially, they can earn a higher amount of interest, but most of these collapsed and caused a downfall of Lehman Brothers and vast amounts of problems for other Wall Street firms. There's also prime mortgages. This is the standard, typical, low-risk mortgage, liked by lenders because of the low risk, but it doesn't carry the highest rate of interest. So in terms of the gamble involved, it's not necessarily the best for the lender. There's also Alt-A mortgages, which are kind of an in-between mortgage. And then what began to rise in the middle of the first decade of the 21st century were option ARM mortgages, adjustable rate mortgages, where the mortgage interest rate goes up or goes down with the prevailing interest rates set by the London Interbank Offer Rate. And these have that potential because when houses are below water, where the value of the property is decreased to below what is owed on the property, and then interest increases because it's pegged to a general interest rate, there is a greater tendency for people to walk away and abandon the property. And this has carried on into the second decade of the 21st century. In recent decades, the issuing and servicing of mortgages have moved away from a single bank issuing a mortgage and then acting to service that for the lifetime of the mortgage. The trend has been to issue mortgages and then step away, sell them off very quickly to somebody else that will service them. And this has been due largely to a drive in the financial markets to use mortgages as ingredients for other securities like hedge funds. The first one that we see on the left, RMBS, it's a real estate mortgage-backed security, and this is a fairly good one. Most of the mortgages in there have a AAA rating. These are going to be prime mortgages and similar mortgages. But what began to happen in the first decade of the 21st century is that these collateralized debt obligations, collateralized by the property, began to be filled up with these subprime mortgages and became very, very risky. However, the bond rating services began to rate them as very good mortgages, very good securities, even though they were filled with highly volatile, toxic assets. And this, again, is part of what led to the collapse of the mortgage-backed security market in 2008. So what have we covered? Well, we've covered the concept of real estate, what it is. We've looked at titles and the attribute of these documents, and the types of tenancy and types of properties. We defined and measured property in terms of the unit of a township, discussed possession of property by different means, looked at deeds and their conveyance from giver to receiver. We discussed the restrictions of use of property. And finally, we addressed the mortgages and the role that mortgages play in the wider financial market. Thank you for being with us today. Hope that you have learned something from this, and we'll see you soon. Goodbye.